Hi, I'm Lisa Rubel of Love to Color My World, and I'm here with another episode of our Skill Builder series, and today we'll be learning how to make star blocks. So I have a Scrappy Star Quilt Kit from Sit and Sew Fabrics. If we look at the pattern here, it's got 12 star blocks that we'll be putting together, and then sashing strips and sashing squares that will go between all of the blocks. Now with this kit, there are 255 pieces inside that you don't have to cut to put the kit together. And that is the time-saving measure of these kits. We've got the squares that will be used for the points and the background of the blocks. And then we've also got, let's look inside here. We've got sashing strips, and we've got the squares that will be used for the star points, and then our sashing squares, and our binding fabric, and our backing fabric. So we've got all the pieces of the quilt right here for us, already cut, except for our backing fabric, and I'll show you how to put a star block together. So our first step for making the Scrappy Star quilt is to sort out the fabrics. We've got this huge range of 3.5-inch squares, a bunch of different fun fabrics. Mine are in shades of red and blue. For each block we will need 5 squares that will be the background, and then 4 squares that will be used for our star point units, and then 8 of these little black squares which are our star points. And you can see in here in the pattern it shows there's 5 squares that will be in the background, and then that's where the 4 are for the star points. So you want to divide your fabric into piles. I like to make some high contrast piles so that my stars really pop off the background. So you can see here I've got a lighter blue that goes with this dark fabric with coral flowers on it. Here's a lighter coral with a medium blue. And then this fun sort of focal red and blue print with a darker navy so that it pops, and a bright red with this black and blue floral. So for each combination I've got some contrast. So you want to keep that in mind and make your piles that have the 5 background fabrics and the 4 star point unit fabrics, and then of course your 8 little mini squares. So I'm going to clear all this out of the way and get started in making a first block. So once you have the pieces picked out for your first block, it's time to draw lines on the back of your small star point squares. Now, if you are using an air-soluble marking pen, you want to know just how air-soluble it is before you begin. Some of them will disappear very quickly, and if you go and mark all your squares, the lines will disappear from the last ones before you get a chance to sew them. So I'd recommend using a water-soluble pen or marking just 8 squares, what you need for one block at a time, and that way you know your lines will still show up. I've got a bright pink pen which shows up just enough on my black squares that I can see it. So I've been drawing lines on the wrong side of each of these squares from on a diagonal, and that will be my stitching line as I put these star points together. Now to speed things up a little bit, I like to, you can see I've got my squares kind of laid out in rough rows, and that way I can just reposition the ruler just slightly as I go to mark the others rather than having to put each square out at a time. It's all about those little efficiency tricks to speed things up. So I'm going to add my star points to my coral squares. So what I'll do is position a marked square right sides together on a coral square. I don't know if you can see my line, but it's going from the center point out. And that way after we stitch the line, trim it and press it, that's what my star point will look like. So I'm going to sew this one in place, and then I'll come back and show you what it looks like. Okay, I've got my line stitched. Let's move these little squares out of the way. And before I press it, I'm going to trim it to 1/4 inch past that stitching line. So I've got my corner trimmed off, and I'm going to come over to my pressing station and press that corner open. You can definitely chain piece these, but you want to do one corner on each square at a time because your second square, you can see there's my first point, will overlap the first one, and that's how you get that nice point between your two star points. So I've got my second piece laid down. Again, my diagonal line is going from the center of one square, or one side of the square, to the center of the other side of the square, and I'm going to go sew down that line. Okay, I've stitched down that line. Now I'm going to trim the seam allowance to 1/4 inch from that line and press this open. And there I've got one star point unit. Now what you can do, like you can see, I've got a little bit extra up here. You can go back and square each of these star point units up so that they are the exact size that you need them to be, which is 3.5 inches. So you can take a ruler, put it on top, and it looks like I only need to trim 2 edges here. And now I'm back to a nice, neat 3.5 inch square. So we're going to make 4 identical star point units that we'll use to assemble our block. So use the technique that I just showed you to make 3 more units, and then we'll put our block together. All right, let's get our blocks assembled. So I've got my first block laid out. I've got my 5 background squares. They're in the 4 corners and the middle, and then each of my star point units on the sides. And so you can see I've got my star shape in the middle with that background color in the center. So the next step is to sew these pieces together in rows. So what I like to do is have my block all laid out right next to my sewing machine so I can just go back and forth, and I flip that second column over onto the first column, and then I know that for each of these I'm going to sew down this edge. And I'll get my pins and add a pin or 2 to each to hold it, and then set it up on my machine to sew. Now you'll notice with my background fabric here, it is a directional print, and you can just put your pieces however you want and it'll look great when if it's directional, or if you want to be more purposeful, you can have all of your pieces headed in the same direction. That's what I've got going on here. I've got these striped leaves sort of going up and down, but it's totally up to you what you want to do. Just pay attention if you want to adjust those. Now the other thing I want to talk about with this is how to get a great point on your star. And the way to do that is to pay attention to where your star point is. So if I flip this one over, as I'm stitching my 1/4 inch seam, if I do it with this piece star point unit on top, I can make sure that my stitch line goes right through that intersection of those 2 seams, and that way when I open it up I'll have a nice crisp point there. So keep that in mind as you're sewing your star point units to your background squares. Okay, I've got the first 2 rows sewn together, or columns sewn together, and I'm going to show you a little trick that I like to use when I'm assembling blocks sort of in a 3x3 grid. So I still actually have these attached together. I haven't unstitched or cut them yet from the chain piecing, and what I'm going to do is flip each of these open. I'm not going to press it until I'm done, but I'm going to flip these open, and then I'm going to take my pieces from my 3rd column and just lay them on top and pin them. And that way I can see that everything is in the right place, and so I'm not worrying about setting something on it backwards, one of these star points. And then after I have these seams sewed, then when I open it up I've got my whole block laid out here, and we'll look at how to put that together. If you don't want to try this method, you can definitely sew each piece together individually. Just make sure that they stay in the right order so that your star points are always clustered around that center and your background squares are in the outside corners. So I've got my 3 rows for the block sewn together, and what I'm going to do is press the seams in different directions so that they can nest. So I'm going to, for the top and bottom block, I'm going to press away from the center unit. And that will help it to lay flat because those seams will not have to fold over. So I'm going to do that for the top and for the bottom. And then for the middle section, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to press to the center, which will also help that lay flat because that's where the seams from the star points are. There we go. So now when I flip these over to assemble, you can see that my seam allowances will nest if I align my seams. So I'm going to pin there and here. And you'll notice that I pin after the seam. And that's because when you pin in front of the seam and you're sewing along, you have to pull the pin out before you even get to the seam. So you're not able to ensure that the pieces stay together tightly. So by pinning after, I can leave the pin in almost until the needle hits that seam that I'm crossing over. And I know that my two pieces stay joined exactly how I want them to stay. So I'm going to sew down this whole line to join the top row and the middle row, and then add the bottom row in the same way, and then we'll take a look at our block. And similar to when we were adding the center square to the star point units, when you go to pin this one in place, if you pin it in such a way that you'll be stitching with your star point unit on the top, you can keep an eye on where your stitch line is in relation to that point where those two seams cross, and that will help you get a nice sharp point there. So make sure that you stitch with your star point unit on the top. Alright, so I've got my first block done. I'm just going to press it to finish it, and because we are adding sashing to these blocks, you don't have to worry about which direction you're pressing the seams in terms of nesting the seams of your blocks together, but I am going to press both of these seam allowances towards the middle because it will allow my block to lay more flat because of the star point units. So there's my first finished block. We're going to make 12 of these and then assemble them with the sashing and the sashing squares. What do you think? I like it. Isn't it amazing how quickly blocks go together when you don't have to do the cutting? I've got 4 different blocks that I've made, and I really love how the different fabric placement changes the look of the blocks based on where your lights and your darks are. So by now you should have all of your blocks made, and I'm going to show you how to put the rows together, both the block rows and the sashing rows. So for the block rows, you're going to lay out 4 blocks, and I'm going to run out of room here, alternating with 3 sashing strips. The sashing strips will go between the blocks, and you're going to sew those together into a block row. You may want to lay all your blocks out at first so that you can get your fabric placement spread out, your darks and your lights, and make sure you have all the blocks in the spot you like them, and then start sewing your block rows together. So when you sew your block rows together, you're going to press your seams toward the sashing strip. And then the other type of row you're going to make are the sashing rows. And those are made with 3 of the same pre-cut sashing strips and these cute little squares. And so each of the rows will have 4 of the little squares and 3 of the sashing strips. And you're also going to press these towards the sashing, because that way when you put the block rows and the sashing rows together, you'll be able to nest your seams. So for both rows, press towards the sashing strips. So you'll get your block rows and your sashing rows assembled, and then you'll sew them together, alternating the block and the sashing rows, and your quilt top will be done. And then you get to use your backing that came with the kit and the pre-cut binding strips so that you're all ready to finish your quilt once it's quilted. I hope you enjoyed making this Scrappy Star block with me, and I can't wait to see what your Scrappy Star quilts look like.